Right, so Israel thought it could bomb Doha, starve Gaza, and sneer at the International Court of Justice, while Europe stayed safely paralysed in its ritual of grave concern. For decades, that bet has, of course, been paying off, though, hasn't it? Brussels wrung its hands, murmured about peace, and quietly signed the trade contracts anyway. Then the Netherlands, more and more making moves to hold Israel accountable of late, lit another fuse. With a few keystrokes in the Schengen database, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich went from swaggering ministers to grounded pariahs across 29 European nations. They can rant all they like in Tel Aviv, but they won't be strutting through Paris or Berlin anytime soon. Israel howled about antisemitism, but the real panic is simpler. Once the taboo is broken, the dominoes fall. Today, 2 bans, tomorrow, trade suspensions, and soon, perhaps Netanyahu himself, ICC arrest warrant aside, might be left peering at Europe from the outside. A precedent has now been set, going very underreported though. Now let it escalate. Right, so when Israel bombed Doha yesterday, it did more than strike a Gulf capital. It obliterated the pretense that diplomacy was still alive. Qatar had been the linchpin of ceasefire talks and hostage negotiations, the last fragile thread connecting Israel and Gaza to a mediated settlement. So by attacking it, Israel sent a clear message. There would be no safe space for negotiation, no respect for mediation, no line it was unwilling to cross. Diplomacy, therefore, was dead, buried under the rubble of Qatari buildings. So against this backdrop of reckless escalation, Europe looked paralysed as usual, though. All the usual epithets came out from leaders, didn't it? Statements of grave concern and calls for restraint issued from Brussels like the repetitive tired wind emanating from a leaky bike tyre. For decades, this has been the EU's role in this conflict, though. Wring the hands, whisper some platitudes, carry on trading with Israel as normal. But one state this year has continued to shatter that mould. The Netherlands. Not historically known for bold departures in foreign policy, they broke with consensus. And they've already branded Israel a national security threat to them, have pushed for suspension of the EU-Israel trade deal along with Sweden, and are now branded 2 senior Israeli ministers persona non grata. By entering Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich into the Schengen information system, the Dutch government did more than slam their own airport doors shut. They slammed 29 doors across Europe to them in a single keystroke. On the surface, it might look like symbolism, this. 2 extremist loudmouths targeted while Netanyahu and Israel Katz and the like are still able to glide through European capitals should they wish. Though Netanyahu's got that arrest warrant to bear in mind, of course. But symbolism can shatter taboos. You have to start somewhere, and precedent can be dynamite. What the Netherlands lit was a fuse here, and it is now racing towards the powder kegs of Brussels and Berlin. Already Spain, Slovenia and Belgium have followed the Dutch lead. Already Ursula von der Leyen, long Israel's shield in Brussels, has been forced to partially suspend that EU-Israel trade agreement that the Dutch were pushing for. The facade of European paralysis is cracked. What was once genuinely unthinkable, Europe turning sanctions inward on Israel, might now perhaps be inevitable. The Dutch decision to bar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich was announced back in late July, actually. It was not packaged as high theatre at that point, but just as a bureaucratic act under Dutch immigration law. Both ministers declared undesirable persons for threatening public order. But when the Netherlands uploaded their names to the Schengen Information System, or SIS, the consequences were much larger than that. The SIS is not a filing cabinet. It's the live operating system of all Schengen borders. Once an entry gets logged in it, it appears at every airport and land crossing. France, Germany, Spain, Norway, Switzerland, all are legally bound to refuse entry. This means Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are barred not just from The Hague, but from Paris and Berlin and Madrid. They cannot attend conferences, they cannot meet counterparts, they cannot even transit through airports. No more Tel Aviv, Frankfurt, New York for them. They must reroute through the likes of Istanbul or Dubai or London. The world just shrunk for them a lot. This is why the Dutch move matters so much. For years, EU leaders hid behind the excuse that sanctions required consensus. The Netherlands just proved otherwise, actually. One government, acting unilaterally, just dragged 28 others along with it because of how the SIS works. The precedent has now been set. Europe is no longer locked in paralysis. Israel, of course, well, they exploded in anger, didn't they? Popped like a pimple. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar hauled in the Dutch ambassador for a reprimand, accusing the Netherlands of turning a friendship into hostility. The Israeli cabinet denounced the decision as an affront to Israel's right to self-defense. Ben-Gvir went further, of course he did. Whole reason he's been picked on, isn't it? Deploying the oldest card in his deck. A Jewish minister from Israel is unwanted, he proclaimed, while terrorists are free. Smotrich accused Europe of surrendering to the lies of radical Islam, because yes, let's get a little bit of Islamophobia in there too. The strategy's obvious, though. Drown accountability in the language of antisemitism once again, twist the targeted sanctions into an assault on Jewish identity, because it is what they always do. It doesn't work anymore, does it? But the fury revealed more than it concealed. If the ban were truly symbolic, Israel could have just shrugged it off. They would have done, surely, wouldn't they? Instead, they've treated it as a crisis. So why is that? It's because Israel knows contagion when it sees it. Today it is Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Tomorrow it could be Gideon Sa'ar. The day after it could be Israel Katz. And after that, Netanyahu himself. Once Europe starts adding Israeli ministers to SIS, the protective wall of impunity all begins to crumble. Now, critics argue that the Dutch picked easy targets here. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are grotesque caricatures, cartoonish people of extremism. They shout about expulsion while Netanyahu mutters about humanitarian resettlement. But the policy on the ground is all the same. Gaza's people starved, displaced, bombarded. By focusing on the loudest extremists, Europe gives Netanyahu cover to pose as the embattled centrist managing a rowdy coalition. Yet this is precisely where symbolism becomes dangerous for Israel. Once a taboo is broken, precedent builds scaffolding. If Europe can brand Ben-Gvir a pariah for calling expulsion, why not Katz afterwards, who openly boasted of blocking food convoys to induce famine? If Smotrich can be banned for denying Palestinian existence, why not, say, the former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, who already faces an ICC arrest warrant request? And once Gallant is in, say, what stops the net from tightening around Netanyahu himself? Arrest warrant issued against him as well. Symbolism, in other words, is not a dead end, it's a door. The Netherlands opened it, and other states are already walking through, albeit by default. The excuses that isolate extremists while sparing moderates are collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. There is, of course, the question of whether every Schengen state will play by the rules, of course. I'm sure you're all thinking that now. Well, what if one of them doesn't play by the rules? The system requires all members to honour the SIS ban, but there is a safety valve built into it. In exceptional circumstances, a government can override this, citing humanitarian grounds, for example, or national interest. That means, in theory, a Schengen state could wave Ben-Gvir or Smotrich through, but what excuse would they need to pull that one off, given who we are talking about here? Yet such a breach would not be quiet either. It would require notifying all other Schengen states, instantly making the decision public. It would be a declaration, not an accident. A government openly siding with Israel's extremists against the collective border regime. Hungary might be tempted. Italy under Meloni could be as well, but the cost would be immense. First, it would expose Schengen's vulnerability, feeding domestic suspicion that common borders are already somewhat like Swiss cheese, full of holes. Second, it would paint the host government as Israel's last refuge, rolling out the red carpet for men known worldwide for incitement to ethnic cleansing. The optics alone would be poisonous. Images of Ben-Gvir strutting in Budapest would not normalise him, they would deepen his stigma. Instead of isolating the Netherlands for acting, the rogue state itself would isolate itself for breaking ranks. And the backlash could be worse than that still. If one member flouted the ban, the case for an EU-wide binding travel blacklist would then become irresistible. A Hungarian stunt could harden Brussels' hand, especially after the fallout of Orban welcoming Netanyahu already several months ago, ignoring the ICC arrest warrant against him, transforming unilateral SIS entries into council-sanctioned measures that no state could escape. What Orban or Meloni might imagine as a favour to Israel could backfire into the very outcome Israel fears the most: binding sanctions backed by EU law. For Israel, then, there's no win. If the bans are respected, the walls of Europe are closed. If a rogue state breaks ranks, it may only accelerate the climb towards pariah status for Israel. The Dutch action must also be looked at from a domestic context, and the role ordinary people have played in this too. In June, The Hague witnessed its largest protest in 2 decades. 150,000 people filled the streets demanding an end to complicity in Gaza's starvation. Polls show only 19% of Dutch citizens hold a favourable view of Israel, while 78% are unfavourable. Public opinion has turned, and with it, political space. Foreign Minister Casper Veldkamp resigned last month, citing his failure to secure stronger EU sanctions. His resignation was more than a personal statement, it was a warning. The Dutch government could not weather the storm of public anger without concrete action. The Schengen bans were the answer, something tangible to offer. More than words, but less than the full sanctions coalition partners resisted. This dynamic is repeating across Europe. In Spain, Belgium, Ireland, public hostility at Israel's conduct is fierce. Protests are swelling. Governments are being forced into action, not by moral clarity at the top, but by pressure from below. The Netherlands lit the path and others are now following. The bans in The Hague reverberated in Brussels too. For decades, the European Commission has mouthed concern while maintaining Israel's trade privileges under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Article 2 of that agreement requires respect for human rights. Israel has trampled it for years without any consequence. Yet this has now just changed as well. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, long seen as Israel's staunchest protector in Brussels, offensively so, was forced to propose a partial suspension. Still a way to go, but considering who we are talking about here, it's still pretty big. Preferential trade access would be pared back, bilateral payments frozen, with token exceptions for civil society and Holocaust remembrance institutions. Even Israel's champions could no longer hold the line. This was no minor step. For the first time, the EU had acted on Article 2, declaring Israel in breach. The facade of legal fiction collapsed. The association agreement, once deemed to be untouchable, is now cracked open. Germany and Italy remain reluctant, but they are swimming against the tide. The question now is not whether escalation continues, it's how far it continues. Travel bans can widen to include all manner of other ministers. Full suspension of the association agreement looms. Arms embargoes, once unthinkable, are on the table in Madrid and Dublin. Financial sanctions could choke settlement-linked companies, and alignment with the ICC would mean Israeli leaders risk arrest the moment they step on European soil. South Africa's pariah status was not born overnight. It accumulated piece by piece until the edifice of apartheid collapsed. Israel seems to be walking the same path here. God knows with all we've seen, we hope so, don't we? The Netherlands gesture may one day be remembered as the first stone removed from the wall, a wall that needs to come crashing down. The bombing of Doha is the game changer. Qatar was the mediator of last resort, the broker of aid access and hostage talks. By striking its capital, Israel declared that it will not tolerate even the semblance of negotiation. It was not just a strike on a city, it was a strike on diplomacy itself. So in this context, symbolic bans are inadequate. They remain important scaffolding, but they cannot be the end point. Europe cannot pretend diplomacy is possible while Israel incinerates the very capitals trying to mediate. The Doha strike makes escalation imperative. Anything less is complicity. Israel is drifting into pariah status in Europe at last. Public opinion has cratered, protests are surging, member states are acting unilaterally against them. Brussels is cracking under the pressure. The ICC is circling with potentially more warrants. Each of these threads tightens the noose further. For decades, Israel relied on Europe's inertia, the safe knowledge that condemnations would never translate into consequences. And yet now they are. What began as bans on two extremist ministers, what begins as bans on two extremist ministers, is metastasizing into trade suspensions and open talk of arms embargoes very quickly. The excuses have run out. Netanyahu cannot hide behind Ben-Gvir and Smotrich forever. Europe knows that their extremism is only a louder version of his own policies. The only question is how far the pariah logic spreads, and when Netanyahu himself will find the Schengen gates closed in his face. The Netherlands' Schengen ban were more than symbolic. They were dynamite placed under the EU's paralysis. One small state pressed enter and 29 borders just slammed shut. Israel howled in protest, not because the measure was empty, but because it knew contagion was coming. Spain, Slovenia and Belgium proved it right. Ursula von der Leyen, forced to act, proved it right. Protests in The Hague, Madrid and Brussels proved it right. Israel bombed Doha and buried diplomacy. Europe cannot pretend business as usual is still an option. The facade of impunity is cracked. The scaffolding for sanctions is rising. What began as a ban on two ministers may end up with Netanyahu himself branded persona non grata. His government cut off from European markets, Israel's largest trade partners, and his generals facing arrest at European airports. For Israel, this is not inconvenience, it is existential bad news. The Netherlands has shown the world that Europe can act, that excuses will no longer hold, and that the walls of impunity can shatter. From here, the question is not if escalation continues, but when. And when it does, Israel will discover that the world has grown very small indeed. And of course, this news has now come hot on the heels of a 9-point plan announced by Spain just yesterday, including a total arms embargo on Israel, Spanish ports and skies closed to Israeli arms transports, all illegal settlement goods being outlawed, more funding for UNRWA, and Israeli war criminals threatened with entry bans there as well. Oh, and just to wind Israel up even more, they've also called for nuclear talks with Iran, a Western nation opening the door to talks with Iran. You can imagine the wailing going on, can't you? So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.